please help me welcome Dr. Andrea.
Short for the microphones. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
No?
I'm going to go turn it up.
Better? Better? Better?
I'll turn it up.
Should I just use the microphone?
I just need to turn it up. I think you're in there. I turned that one off. Go ahead and keep talking with your lapel mic, and I'll just turn it up at the top.
We'll get there. Okay. Ready? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's quite an honor to be here and be asked to come by the Stillwater Public Library to share our history, the history of the Osage people. Typically, through time, the last decades, most Native American tribes have had their histories told for them by anthropologists, by archaeologists, by historians, ethnographers, and a lot of times that history is incorrect. And so what we are trying to do now is provide our perspective of our history based on our knowledge and our oral traditions. We have a whole series of volumes that record our oral traditions and our history. And I'm going to share some of that with you this evening. But we also rely on the scientists. We rely on Western science. We rely on the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the historians, the linguists. We pull all this information together to try to present what we think as the Osage Nation, as Osage people, what is our real history and where have we been on the landscape. And so what I would like to do is take you through this and try to bring you right up to the present day. I know I don't have a lot of time to do that. It's a lot of history, but I'm going to try to make it through all the way to the present time. So you'll see on the screen those odd letters. That is our orthography of our language. And then I've tried to give you the translation of it, Osage, meaning Osage. This is our name. And we want to begin with our creation story, because that is where we believe our origin begins. And we have the elders of our tribe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, relay that tradition to us, and it was written down. And the story that is told is that in the beginning, in our origins, we were spirit beings. We were spirit beings up in the heavens, and there were 4 stages of the heavens. And we wanted to come down to earth. We wanted to have a physical body. We referred to ourselves as the little ones at that time. And we went to other spirit beings that were in the heavens and asked them for help to allow us to come down to earth. And it went through a whole series of individuals that they requested this help from. And finally, it was the eagle that came to our aid. And the eagle said that he would take us down to earth. That we had to follow him, and you had to go travel in 3 groups. And he said, follow closely and I'll take you down. I'll take you through each of the heavens, and we'll travel down and we'll make it down to earth. So in 3 groups, the little ones traveled and followed the eagle, made it down to earth, and the eagle told them to, stretch out your legs because now you have a physical being, and land in the oak trees. And so they came down and they landed in those oak trees in 3 groups. And all of this is significant, the numbers and the colors that they talk about. This is just the basics of the story that I'm telling you. And so they landed in the trees, and they noticed that all around them it was water. But they wanted to get down to the surface. So they called on a lot of different entities on Earth, the water spider, the leech, all these water beings, and none of them could really help clear the water so that they can come out of the trees. And finally, it was the great elk, Opong Tonka, that helped the little ones to come down out of the oak trees. He blew to the four winds and blew the water away so that Earth could be seen. And so then the little ones came down in the 3 groups and started traveling across the landscape. And as they traveled across the landscape, they came across a river. And in that river was a spirit, the water spirit. And he called that first group over and he said, "Come, look at what I am, the spirit of the water. Look at the energy that I have, the life force that I am." The water spirit told them, "Take of me my energy and the strength that I have and the life-giving force that I am. And that is who you are. Take that." And he named them the Osage people, the water people. And he said, "That also means that you're the name givers." And he said, "Turn to the other 2 groups and name them as well." And so they turned to the other 2 groups. The first one, the sky people, Tsichu, and then the other, land people, Hunka. So that's how we got the original 3 divisions of our tribe, the groups of our tribe. And from there, we continue traveling across the landscape. And there's a whole series of stories and oral traditions that talk about how we move across the landscape in our migrations. But that is the beginning. That is where we say that we come from, that we are from the stars. So we look at these traditions, and you can see them. It's even represented in the mural in our Congress. In Pawhuska, we have an Osage Congress. And you can see it represented by that mural, the oak trees. You've got the people coming down out of the trees, and you'll see some of the other life symbols represented there that we took on, the different clans. So this is really important for us. This tradition, these oral traditions, are something that all tribes have, essentially, because there were no written language across what would become, the United States, North America. None of the tribes had a written language. And so this is how information was passed down from generation to generation. It was telling of these stories. And these stories had so many repeated lines and repetition because you had to memorize them. But they made it down through history. They made it all the way to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then were actually written down. And that is something very special that we have, is those oral traditions that tell us stories about who we are and what's important to us in our life and how we need to live our own life. A lot of symbolism in those stories and a lot of information. Now we as the Osage, we have 4 other tribes that are very closely linked to us by our language, the Degial language. You've got the Omaha, the Quapaw, the Kaw, and the who'd I miss? Ponca. our 4 sister tribes up here. We all speak a very similar language. And each of us has these oral traditions in them. And in those oral traditions, each of those distinct tribes today talk about the fact that all of us were at one time in history one tribe. We were one group, we spoke the same language, and we lived together as one group. All of these different tribes have this same oral tradition. And they say that we were one group back in the Ohio River Valley, that's where we were one. And some of the traditions actually talk about the fact that we were even one further back, all the way back to the Chesapeake Bay area. So we know for sure, and I have to look at this information as a scientist, as a Western scientist, but I also have the native science as well. And so I have to look at the different lines of evidence and try to weigh out what exactly do I believe of all of this information. And that's what I'm presenting to you all, is the best information that we could gather to create this history of the Osage people. And what we're seeing is that using archaeology, using anthropology, using the oral traditions, that the Ohio River Valley is probably the place where we were all one. We also look at the linguistic evidence as well. And throughout the long history, the chronology of time, the archaeologists break up time and give them arbitrary names. And each of these sections of time represent when cultures were all doing the same thing. Essentially, they were hunters, or they lived in certain types of houses, used certain types of tools. That's how they distinguish these different times and evolution of cultures. So in the United States, we have a whole series of going back to the Archaic period, then they have the Woodland period, the Mississippian period. These are all just arbitrary names given that the archaeologists use so that they can talk with one another about the same time periods. And when I look at the archaeological record and contemplate when we could have been all one group together, looking at the artifacts, looking at the house structures and so forth, I can say that during what is known as the Middle Woodland period, this 100 BC to AD 500, that this is probably a very good guess, an educated guess from the science and the native science, that this is probably where we were all together as one. So that's where we start seeing our footprint on the landscape. During the Middle Woodland period, towards the end of it, somewhere around AD 200, 400 AD, there is a movement that we believe occurred. There's a migration that starts. And we see this in the archaeological evidence, the artifacts, but we also see changes in the linguistic evidence as well. We have a linguist from the University of Kansas, Dr. Bob Rankin, who has studied the Siouan language and has come up with his idea about when the Siouan language, the Degial Siouan language, started splitting up and the tribes started becoming distinct entities. He's using a whole different line of evidence than the archaeology and what I was using. And he defined very specific times in the past when these splits occurred. And so I use this information as well. And what he's using is, he's looking at the terms for corn, beans, squash, the arrow, parts of the arrow, the bow, the projectile points, the ends of them, things that we can find archaeologically. We can find bits and pieces of corn. We can find beans charred that are in the soil. So he was looking specifically at things that archaeologists could see so that we could match our records together. So this is what we did. He's looking at each of these in each of the distinct 5 tribes and looking at the terms for the different cooking methods for corn, the different cooking methods for beans. You know, how many processing terms do you have? So he was looking at all this, what I think is magical information. The linguist part is really beyond me. But he's taking that line of evidence, and so we match that with ours. And what we come up with is that we're seeing a transition that occurs where the Degial people are starting to move out of the Ohio River Valley, and they go down south towards the Mississippi River. And this movement is somewhere occurring between 200 and 500 AD, so that when we get down to the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio, we're right around 400, 500 AD. And when we get to this point, the first change occurs, the first split occurs. The Quapaw decide that they want to go south. All the rest of the group wanted to go north. So in the linguistic evidence and our evidence, we can see this, where a group that will become the Quapaw turns south and go down the Mississippi River. The rest of them all go north. and start migrating out into the tributaries of Missouri and Illinois. And so during this period, what is known as the late woodland period, we see the migration of these people out into the tributaries, establishing homesteads and setting up shop essentially in the Missouri and Illinois areas. And this, still during this period, we've got the four, the Omaha, Ponca, Kaw, and the Osage are all together as one group. They're speaking the same language, they understand one another. They're just growing in population, growing in numbers. And at some point around 900 AD, there becomes this centering of their population around the St. Louis area. And what occurs is a huge population growth. We see a lot of changes in the culture. We see corn being grown for the first time as a mass product that is going to be used and traded. We've got long distance trade that is occurring to all coasts. A huge economic development springs up in this confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And this, if some of you may be aware, is where Cahokia is, where all of the mounds, huge mounds, well, they call it Mound City, and there are hundreds of them there. And this is the culture that we were a part of, that we developed. So we know that these four tribes were there and building this civilization. And a huge civilization did occur somewhere on the order of perhaps 20,000, maybe even 30,000 people were in this location. And so with that many people, you've got to have a lot of control, political control, religious control. So we have the culture itself becoming very complex. And having to keep control of that many people is quite a feat. So we see this culture thrive for several hundred years. And then the linguist, Dr. Bob Rankin, then indicates that through his research, we see the next split. And that occurs around 1000 AD. And this is when the Ponca and the Omaha decide that they want to leave the rest of the group, and they go either north or west first, where the traditions tell of a couple of different routes that they take. One of them talks about them leaving the St. Louis area and going north up the Mississippi and then crossing over on the Des Moines. Another one talks about them just going right up the Missouri and then coming out onto the plains and up into Iowa. So somewhere around 1000 AD, we see this split with the Omaha and the Ponca. So that leaves, of the Degiog groups that are there, it's the Osage and the Kaw that remain. Now that's not to say that throughout this time at Cahokia that we were the only ones there. There were other tribes certainly that came in and were a part of that development and were a part of that political regime that occurred there. We were just one of them that was at the beginning of that development and were really a strong player in that political and economic civilization that thrived. Now the next split, Dr. Rankin talks about occurring about 200 years later. And this is when the Kaw decide to split off and they go up the Missouri River, which leaves the Osage. And we're the only ones remaining there in the St. Louis area at Cahokia. And we're there for only probably another 150 years or so. There's a lot that is going on to result in our departure from that area. There's a lot of things that occur that are devastating the environment, the climate itself. We have some climate changes that occur which impact the agriculture, the food supply, and of course when you've got shortages in food supply, people aren't so happy, and you have a lot of fighting, warfare within and from outside. So there's a lot of different things that occur that result in this, what is known as the collapse of Cahokia. And so we, as a tribe, what will become the Osage, leave the St. Louis area around 1350, and we essentially move into our backyard because we have been in Missouri. I mean, this was our hunting grounds, this was our trading grounds. We are very familiar with this location and the fruits of this area. So we don't have to move very far. This is a very rich environment if we just go a little bit west out into the Missouri hinterlands. And when we talk about our time period, the most recent time period of AD 500 to the 1800s, we are essentially having our homestead in the states of Missouri and Arkansas. This is where we thrived for the next several hundred years, taking control of the landscape and being very successful in setting up our new trade networks and what will become very fruitful for us economically very shortly. The Ozarks, which are the landscape that is in central southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, the Ozarks are rich with our history. And we can see our footprint in this area through what is left of our villages, our hunting camps, trails, burials. They litter the landscape. We have amassed some information about our trails that we know of. We don't know of all of them, of course, but we are engaging in a mapping process that is trying to get all of these outlined so that we can see where we were throughout this area. So we're doing a pretty good job of getting them mapped out. But through this area, the sacred sites are particularly important to us. They represent our existence in these states. The physical and the spiritual aspects of our culture they're still there. And this is what we try to protect through the office that I work with, the Historic Preservation Office. This is what we are engaged in daily, is trying to protect those resources. The sacred sites include rock art and the burials, which can occur in a variety of locations, from the hilltops, the caves, in the rock shelters and on bluffs. They're littered. There are thousands and thousands of Osages that are buried and are still on the landscape in Missouri and Arkansas. Our rock art, we are coming to understand more and more through the help of some of the researchers at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville and up in Washington University in St. Louis. This is one of our pieces of rock art that is in Arkansas. The one on the left is what it actually looks like in the visual light. The one on the right is in computer enhanced version so that you can actually see the figures. And what this has been interpreted as is a representation of our origin dance, where when we were coming down out of the red oak trees and coming down onto the landscape, that this is the dance that is depicted in this piece of rock art. Up in Missouri, we have a very important piece of art that has been created in the past that also depicts parts of our origin tradition. This is outside of St. Louis in Picture Cave, dating to that Mississippian period, and we can certainly see through what's depicted there certain aspects of our ceremonial, things that we wear in the ceremonies, as well as some of the actual individuals in our origin traditions. So then we have a great turn of events. We've been coming along just fine, migrating across the landscape, doing our own thing, and then we have the contact with Europeans. So in 1673, Marquette and Joliet make their voyage down the Mississippi, and they are the first to record the location of the Osage and say that the Osage are in southwest central Missouri. They never meet the Osage. It's some of the Indians over there that now have moved into Cahokia that tell them about the Osage. So this is what marks for us the beginning of our historic period, 1673. And at that time, we start seeing information about our tribe being recorded by the missionaries, the traders, the early explorers that are coming out into the West. And the first thing that we find out through our studies of this information is that Osage or Osage was not our original name. At contact, it was Neokanska, which means children of the middle waters. And again, it's reflecting on that importance that was imparted to us about the water. And we have always congregated to the confluence of major riverways because of the strength that is generated with those powerful sources coming together. So we have taken that on, well, in the past, we took that on as the name of our whole tribe, Neokanska. But it got corrupted down through time where we ended up with Osage, which was, if you think about what probably happened is that the French came along and came across some Osages and asked them what they called themselves, and they probably said Osage, meaning that they were probably of the water people group, not thinking that they were talking about the whole tribe. And so that stuck immediately, and that's how we got the name Osage, which, of course, going from French to Spanish to English, got corrupted to Osage. So that's how we got our name. Now for what we call the proto-historic period, which is the period in history when people do not have writing themselves, but somebody comes in and writes about them. So the proto-historic period, we have archaeological sites that we have identified and have excavated at. I've had the honor of being able to excavate at many of these through when I first started college. But you can see we went through a lot in a very short period of time, going from 1673 under French control, and then quickly within decades we go through a Spanish control and then down into the American control. So there's a lot that happens. There's a lot of transition of trying to understand people who don't speak the same language, have different agendas for why they're there and what they want to do with the Indians that are there. There's a lot. I mean, I could talk forever just on this part, but what I want to do is take you through just some of the highlights of what we learned through this. The French we got along with very well and learned the trade that would work best for us with the fur trade, and we latched onto that and were very, very successful. Through the trade, then they realized that they needed to bring in the missionaries, right on the heels of that, because then you had to get these savages civilized. If you're going to work with them, if you're going to do business with them, they need to be civilized. So then we start getting information about the organization of the tribe, the spiritual organization, the cosmological organization. And we understand that they start to write about how the tribe saw itself as a reflection of the universe itself, and that every individual, every clan, every division represented a part of the universe and had a role in the universe. Even down to the very individual, you had a role that you had to play in every aspect of the daily living of the tribe, to the rituals that were performed, everything was highly organized, and including down to the people, where we have the two large divisions, the sky people and the earth people, and then those are further broken down into clans that are categorized as the original Tsichu, which is the sky, the original 7, and then you've got the Hunka, the 7 clans there, and then the Osage, the 7 water clans, and then later, as the name says, last to come, you've got 2 clans that join us, and then the isolated earth people join us, so that we end up with 24 clans total. But the original were over 21 clans. So the missionaries and the people that are meeting with the Osage now are starting to record this information and starting to understand who we are and how we organize ourselves. And this organization goes right down to how we set up our villages, where you've got this east-west line that splits the village between the Moettes. So this is the sky to the north and the earth to the south. You have a sky chief and an earth chief. They have their lodges right in the middle. These are large lodges. And then all of the clans, according to their divisions, the sky people, the last to come, all of these had their places. And we can see this, and this is what the studies that we're starting to do, is see this in the villages that we've excavated and trying to define those lines, that east-west line, and identify which were the chiefs' lodges and so forth. So in everyday life, what they're recording is that we had semi-permanent villages. They were, the houses themselves, the lodges, were these structures that are referred to as longhouses, where they were covered with mats, rush mats. I like this picture, but it's incorrect in one aspect, and I need to have somebody paint a better one. The doors are in the wrong place. See all the doors at the end? The doors weren't at the end. The doors were right on the side. If I can get my little pointer to point there. They were right in the middle on the sides of each of these, and the doors faced east. So we've got these that range in size from 25 feet to, 30 feet long. And the lodges varied by the camps, of course, but we are starting to see the organization. And this slide I threw in there to show you that the structure of those lodges lasted right on through to when we came down into Oklahoma. We just used them for different, outside different arbors. But that same construction of those lodge poles, bending them over, is we carried through right here into Oklahoma. The subsistence for the tribe, again, we were in the Ozarks, we were hunting, we had 3 major hunts during the year, one which took us out onto the plains, and that was the summer hunt for the bison and the deer, but we also had other hunts that focused on the bear and the beaver in February and March. This is what they'd be doing right now. And then in the fall, after they would harvest their corn, beans, and squash, then they would once again go out in September to gather more meat. And of course our staples, corns, beans, and squash, but what is important, and we're looking at our history of our food and what we accomplished through time that we know as archaeologists, as we've studied these archaeological sites. We were one of the first folks that domesticated some of the native plants here. If we go back to that time period in the Ohio River Valley, we've got some of the first evidence of domesticating mayflower and sunkweed, chenopodium, little barley. We were very creative in terms of trying to pull together our nutrition and actually settling down and not having to go around and chase your food, essentially, through the seasons. We started doing domesticating certain plants. That area, the Ohio River Valley, is one of 7 locations in the world where domestication started. So we're pretty proud of that as well. So then as we go through our history, we enter this time period after we first meet with the French and the Spanish, and then we have a real turning point in time, and that's with the Louisiana Purchase. And with the Louisiana Purchase, as most of you probably know, they're going to move the Indians in the east and get them out of the way of development on the eastern seaboard and move them out across the Mississippi River and over into what was identified as the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, the problem with that is you have people that's already there and have been there for hundreds of years. And so this, of course, caused a lot of grief for not only the tribes themselves, but then the government that was trying to create a more inhabitable place is making it 10 times worse for these areas with the inclusion of what now are going to be the Americans and all of these different tribes that are coming in and having to live next to one another, many of which were enemies. So what happens for the Osage is that we end up with a whole series of treaties succeeding our land to the United States government. And this is a sore point of what actually happened and what we were able to claim as our territory. This began with the Treaty of 1808 and didn't end until we ended up with the reservation in Oklahoma. So you can see the series of 1808 giving up most of Missouri and Arkansas, and then 1818 we give up more of Arkansas and Oklahoma, 1825 Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas, and then the treaties in Kansas which get diminished. And in the end, we're looking at 113 million acres roughly, which we receive probably a penny for every 6 acres. And it was a hard road to hoe when we look at this and look at what was once our land and what we actually received for it and what we've got now. So the Kansas reservation in 1865, our last move, occurred. It was agreed upon, and then we actually made the move in 1872 during the winter. And we moved down into the reservation. And this also was kind of bittersweet because Oklahoma was our hunting grounds from beginning, probably around AD 500. This was area that we considered ours, that we were hunting in for hundreds of years. And then it gets ceded to the United States government, then it gets turned over to the Cherokee, and we have to buy it back from the Cherokee, our own land. So the history is very interesting when you get down to the details of all these transactions. Oops. But once we got down into Oklahoma, there's a whole series of events that occur that you're going to learn a whole lot about over the next few weeks, which I'm not going to talk about. The oil and what happened with that, you'll hear from others about that. I just want to mention that for us, in 2006, it was very important for us that we were able to create our own constitution. The United States government did not allow us to do that for over 100 years. So we were very happy to do that and create our own government, which we created a government that's just like the United States government with a congressional branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. But it works, and so we thought, something works, let's give it a try. And through that, 2006, and with the expansion of our government through economic development, through gaming, we were able to expand offices, and one of those was our historic preservation program, which I was very happy to see finally come along. And they asked me to come back and start that program in 2007. So I was very happy to do that. And our office engages in preservation activities through federal laws that allow us to go back to these states that we were in and to identify our sites, our significant sites, our graves, all of the thousands of people that we have buried in these other states, and try to preserve these locations and protect our people. So our full ancestral territory ranges in 15 states. All of this is not at one time, it's through time. But this is the charge of our program, is to try to protect this, and it's quite the hefty mission that we're trying to do, but I give it my best shot. And that's what I have for you this evening.